The battle in the world, and Trump said it, is I want a world of sovereign nations, not a globalist financier class.
But in the West, nobody questions this. And they also don't question how come for the last more than 2,000 years, there has been a very large community of Jews who live in Iran unmolested, and they're the second largest Jewish community in the whole of Middle East after Israel.
I've been in this political fight for over 5 decades, and I wasn't sure I would ever live to see the possibility of actually restoring the real United States of America.
I think it's a little bit worse than that. It seems that they're actually doing their utmost to trigger a military conflict somewhere, except they cannot be seen as the instigators of a first strike nuclear attack somewhere. What they're trying to do is to provoke either Russia or Iran or Pakistan to launch a nuclear strike somewhere, to cause absolute chaos and mayhem, because they think that this is the only way that they could save themselves and their system. I think if all else fails, they will sacrifice Israel and they'll have Netanyahu launch a nuclear attack.
Take the first step towards online privacy. Get NordVPN.
Tyranny becomes law, rebellion becomes a duty. So said Thomas Jefferson. Go to bit.ly/lawful tax protest or bit.ly/make war history and find out why it is a criminal offence to pay central government or local government taxes in the UK. bit.ly/lawful tax protest or bit.ly/make war history. And let's make war history. Hi everybody, I am joining Susan Kokinda from Promethean, Action, and Alex Krainer, who is the Naked Hedgie. Aren't you, Alex? Whatever that means.
Yeah.
That's your Twitter handle, Naked Hedgie. Please follow him. I'll have the links for Susan Kokinda's X and also Promethean Action. Please follow them. And this is the first time ever in history that Susan Kokinda and Alex Krainer have met to have a conversation. Thank you both.
Thank you.
Great to be here.
Yes. Anything you guys want to say? Just a teeny weeny bit about yourselves or whatever that I haven't covered?
Well, I'll just say that I've been in this political fight for over 5 decades, and I wasn't sure I would ever live to see the possibility of actually restoring the real United States of America. And after these last 5 years or so, or 10 years or so, really, from the point Trump went down the escalator, I can actually see the potential for doing that. So I think it's very exciting but challenging times.
Yes. And then in an interview you and I recorded a couple of weeks ago, you started off as a Democrat. But then there are Democrats like Gabbard and RFK in Trump's administration because, well, he's a sovereigntist and Gabbard and RFK are sovereigntists, so good for them. Alex, anything about you want to say? Long time no speak, Alex.
Very long time no speak. What can I say? I'm an analyst, author, former hedge fund manager, and let's say someone who would prefer to see a future of peace and prosperity rather than war and misery. So that's my motivating motif.
Yes. Okay. All right. Very good. Well, yesterday I recorded a video with Alex Krainer and Ian Burlingame, and I started off with their take with the Epstein files. And Alex said, "I knew you were going to start about that, so I'm determined that today I don't start with that." Right? What about Netanyahu's visit to the White House this week? And what's coming out of that? Now, for people who don't know, I'm Pakistani, I'm Muslim. You know, it is a concern for me and for my family, as it is for many, many people, Muslims and non-Muslims, about what is happening there, the genocide in Gaza, and then talks about relocating the Palestinians, which should just be an extension of the genocide that's already happening. So, Susan, do you want to start with that?
Well, I'll tell you, whenever I think about what Trump is doing on any of these incredibly complex situations, of which the Mideast is number one, but also Russia, Ukraine, or any of these other situations that have been deliberately created over decades and sometimes centuries by the British Empire, what people today call the global elite. I start not from what's right in front of me today and what Trump did last week with Netanyahu or what he may do next Monday in terms of Russia, because number one, I don't know. And number two, I know what his intention is. And I think that's the thing that people really have to hang on to in very, very turbulent times. Donald Trump, I believe, is intent on overthrowing the entire system of British geopolitics, which has been in place for at least a century and a half. And there's no place where it has been more terribly, skillfully played than in the Mideast. Now, I'm not Donald Trump, so I don't know all the factors that he's actually dealing with, but I know that he's approaching the Mideast from a completely different standpoint. That is, he doesn't look at each of the elements as a pawn on a chessboard, as every previous administration has, as the Halford Mackinder and British geopolitics have schooled geopoliticians in for over a century. He takes each nation, each interest group at face value, and then tries to figure out how do we find a pathway toward peace. And for him, it is always going to be underlain by the question of economic development. The man that I trained under for 5 decades, Lyndon LaRouche, always made absolutely clear there will be no peace in the Mideast unless you actually have a viable path forward for genuine economic prosperity for everybody. The people of Gaza, the people of Israel, the people of Yemen, the people of Lebanon, and so on. And that's what he tried to do in his first term with the Abraham Accords, with a bit of success, but he obviously didn't have a chance to finish it. It's obviously a very tricky situation. He doesn't control Netanyahu. He certainly doesn't control the crazy Zionist right-wing fundamentalist faction inside Israel. So he's got to deal with all of these things. And on the other hand, he doesn't control the radical Islamicists of whatever brand they may happen to be. So he's dealing with all of these elements. But I think what is different is that he actually wants peace, as opposed to every president who has come before. The only one who came close, of course, was Clinton. I'll grant that maybe he wanted peace, but I don't think he was prepared to buck the globalist system to get it. And what he did with Rabin and Arafat obviously didn't last, largely because Rabin was assassinated by a crazy Zionist. But I don't think Clinton was ready to buck the system. So that's what's different about Donald Trump. He wants to change the system. And so each step of the way, and I've experienced this in these last 5.5 months, he makes a decision and I say, holy crap, why did he do that? Like bombing Iran, right? I mean, that was a bad night, right?
Yeah.
It didn't just kick off another perpetual war. But I've sort of learned something, and I also learned it from Lyndon LaRouche, because I had this experience over the decades too. Why the hell did you do that? What are you trying to do? I have no idea where this is going, but I've learned to have a certain amount of patience when I trust somebody's intention and their strategic competence to just sort of say, all right, take a beat. Let's see where this actually goes.
Okay. I'm going to push back and then not give you a chance to reply, because then I'll move it on to Alex. But you can later, right? See, I want what you say to be true. And I'm not in any position or have enough confidence to say whether it is or isn't, whether you're right or wrong. But I'm willing to entertain it and discuss it and consider it and to learn from you and also from Alex. Isn't this just like people like you and I who would rather have had Trump than Biden or Harris, projecting on him what we want him to do, how we want him to be versus what he's doing? And I reference he's now going to give defense armaments to Ukraine, so going to continue with the slaughter of Slavic men on both sides, and then dropping sanctions on Jelani's regime, which is an MI6 setup, I believe, and they're going around slaughtering Christians. I mean, geez, it's upsetting, Susan. And you can say something if you want, or Alex can come in.
Go ahead, Alex.
Well, I agree with Susan, Rich, and I've gone through the same kind of dilemmas already from his first term, because I remember being profoundly disappointed when he launched a missile raid against Syria in 2017, I think. And then, if you waited a couple of days, you realized that nothing happened, that he made a big show. And then, first he gave the Russians an hour's pre-advice so that, everybody could move out of the way. And I think half of the missiles never really got there. Allegedly, they were shot down by the Russians. and the other half landed in an empty lot. But it did have an effect at home because, in the United States, in the mainstream, there's this entrenched thinking that the United States is doing its stuff if they're bombing somebody. So you had the whole media apparatus, practically celebrate, oh, Trump is finally acting presidential, and you had that guy, what's his name, Brian Williams, gushing about the beauty of our weapons, and so everybody went into this frenzy, and so now he basically bolstered his public support for nothing, and he didn't really hurt Bashar al-Assad's regime. He didn't hurt Syrian Arab Army. He didn't do any of that. And then also remember, there was a period of time when there was like a really ugly war of words going on between Trump and Kim Jong-un in North Korea. And, you thought, at one point in time, you thought, oh my God, they're going to bomb North Korea. They're going to go to war against North Korea. But at the same time, while this war of words was going on, Trump had actually sent a mission to China and to South Korea and if I remember correctly, maybe Singapore, laying the ground for a meeting with Kim Jong-un. And then they had a really good meeting. And there was, until it all got derailed by the imperial faction, we thought there was going to be peace between North and South Korea. And they actually began demining the demilitarized zone between the two countries, which was absolutely spectacular. But of course, he was constantly nonstop sabotaged during his first term. And I think that in this time around, he's playing a different game, which is extremely frustrating to watch, because I'm again being tossed around thinking like, oh my God, what are they doing? When they bombed Yemen, I thought this is completely insane. What can they bomb now that they haven't bombed for the previous 10 years? And it turned out it was probably a fake as well. I mean, they did blow up some stuff. There were casualties, but we still don't have an explanation for this, by the way. But I think that he was basically doing something to show that he's doing something in order to avoid going to war against Iran. And he never went to war against Iran. So everything he's been doing so far, I think, have been kind of World Wrestling Federation displays of toughness, but nobody's really getting hurt. That is, relatively speaking, in geopolitical terms. Mm. And he's been obviously trying to reach out not just to the Iranians. He's hugely important and deserves a lot of credit. He reached out to the Russian. He speaks on the regular with Vladimir Putin. Extremely important. His speaking on the regular to Xi Jinping. He's even reached out to Hamas. He's speaking with the Iranians. So I think that if you set aside the rhetoric, which I think is mostly for the domestic for the domestic consumption of the political class in Washington, D.C., and you focus on what is actually going on, what are the actual results of his policies, you do see that he is trying to turn the ship, the USS United States, away from warmongering, away from being the military enforcement arm of the empire, and really towards the multipolar integrations. Now, he's facing extremely powerful opposition in this, because the most powerful segment of the American society are exactly the people who have drawn the greatest benefit from the United States being the imperial superpower and benefiting from the British free trade system. So obviously, if they perceive him to be undermining their privilege or being potentially ending their privilege status, they're going to want him dead. They probably already do. But for that reason, he has to kind of move in an unpredictable fashion and gain his position marginally. And I still think that his most important priority in all this is bolstering his political position at home, to make sure that he has, political backing to make all these changes that he's intending. And, in addition to these very privileged segments of society who are extremely nervous about him, he's taking on the big pharma, he's taking on the big ag, he's taking on the big banks. he's taking on the military-industrial complex because there was talk about having the military budget ridding the world of nuclear weapons. These people don't want that. This is their milk. This is their milk cow. And so having this political backing at home is going to prove very important. So that, I think, is his priority. And so I think a lot of these incomprehensible plays at home serve that purpose primarily.
Susan, anything you want to add?
Well, earlier this week, Trump did another one of his open cabinet meetings. And if you paid really close attention to this, and I referenced it in my midweek update, a couple of times he said something really very deliberate. He acts like he's off the cuff. This man doesn't do anything off the cuff.
I was going to say, people underestimate him. They really do.
And that's an important negotiating strategy. It was actually the same thing with Dwight Eisenhower. Dwight Eisenhower was perceived of just being, like a good general and so on. Among other things, he was a master bridge player. And, he also came across as kind of, not at the top of the foreign policy class or something. And there's one anecdote in terms of some initiative he made. I can't remember what it was, but he presented some new foreign or national security policy, which was highly articulated and very impressive. And somebody asked, well, who wrote that? He said, I did. But, he used that to very, very good effect. And I think so does Donald Trump. But in this cabinet meeting on 2 different occasions, when he was talking about Operation Midnight Hammer, he talked about our so-called enemies. I was talking to our perceived enemies, people who perceive that they could potentially be our enemies. He's obviously talking about Russia, China, Iran, whatever. He's calling them perceived, so-called enemies. He does not believe the establishment globalist line that we are always going to be in conflict with Russia. We will always be in conflict with Iran. Even people who are fairly firm MAGA supporters like Steve Bannon, we are always going to be in conflict with Iran. No, Trump doesn't think that way. Now, does he think that we may, end up in a conflict because Iran is doing a particular thing which is damaging our interests, or in terms of Russia? He's obviously frustrated. But is he frustrated because he thinks Russia is our permanent enemy and we are always going to be in conflict with him? Or is he simply taking what Putin is doing at face value and saying, I don't like it, and will proceed to negotiate however he intends to negotiate? But I think it's a completely different characteristic that people have to wrap their minds around. You have somebody who does not think and does not act to the extent that he can act, and he doesn't control his whole government yet. He's got the top layer in some places, and a few places like John Ratcliffe, say the jury is still out in terms of how much he's got control of that agency. But, he obviously, deep down, all of these institutions, they're still largely populated by people who have a completely different outlook than he did. But he has a completely different way of looking at things. And as he said at one speech, I think in Southeast Asia, I look at every nation as a star in a beautiful constellation or jewels on a necklace. He really does believe in national sovereignty. And that doesn't mean that another sovereign nation's interests are not going to conflict with ours, but that's where diplomacy comes in, not war.
Yes. Well, I wanted to also add something, Susan, and I know that you at Promethean Action know all about this, but I think that, and with regards to Iran, an extremely interesting episode came to pass in 2019 when I think it was in June of 2019, the Iranians downed U.S. Reaper drone in the Straits of Hormuz. And then a whole series of events happened that ultimately led to the withdrawal of British Ambassador Sir Kim Darroch, now Lord Kim Darroch, from Washington, and the British had to nominate a new ambassador. So what we learned from that episode was that it was the British embassy who was exerting pressure and orchestrating to pressure Trump into launching a war against Iran. And things got bad enough when he declined that Derek shot off a number of cables to the British embassy. Deeply frustrated with Trump, he said he was never on board. He used that phrase, and that phrase meant he was never on board with the idea of going to war against Iran. And they called him names. They called him erratic, incompetent, all kinds of these things. And then Anonymous, the whatever that organization is, my understanding was that at the time it was controlled by the FBI, leaked all those cables publicly, and they came out in New York Times. And Trump was very aware of this. So there is no, I think that there is no way that he doesn't know who the real enemy is, because he lived through this. Not only that, Sir Kim Derek was the one who played the key role in vetting Christopher Steele as the key protagonist of the Russiagate. And then everybody involved in the Russiagate, Hillary Clinton and the DNC were kind of side participants, but those who were the instigator and who stage managed everything were virtually to the last person British intelligence assets. And Trump was at the receiving end of this Russiagate practically his whole first term, so he would know exactly what has been going on and who is trying to stab him in the back. So it doesn't. I'm glad to hear that he so pointedly said our supposed or our so-called enemies, because that tells me that he knows who the real enemy is.
Yes.
Yeah, I think so.
Yes, and Putin knows who the real enemy is. Putin and Medvedev and others in the Russian government have said as much. The Anglo-Saxons, those in Britain and London. So, okay, all right. But then this sounds a little bit like 445D chess.
No, I don't
trust
think
the
so.
plan.
Even I just think that this is information that is being kept from us.
Okay.
And I also think it looks more confusing than it is, because if you're just sort of operating in one dimension, which is how most people have been, or two dimensions, have been thinking, you take the establishment approach, it's a fight between communism and capitalism, or big government or little government. You live in a world where you just have, two sides of this thing. And then somebody comes in and says, no, that's not actually the way the world works. There's something else. There's the American system, for example, in terms of economics. But you're still trying to analyze things from the standpoint of these two simple contradictions. Well, it looks confusing. But when you actually get out of that controlled mindset, where if you don't like big government spending, then you have to be a libertarian and you don't want any government spending. I mean, that's the game they've played. If and again, this question of permanent enemies, if you don't think we should be going to war with Russia, then you must be a communist or something like that. But again, if you dial the clock back, it's very useful to dial the clock back to the 19th century, because you had a much clearer understanding, at least among certain layers in the United States, certainly among the political elites, the good American political elites, who actually understood who the enemy was. The enemy was the British Empire. Yeah. Our potential friends were all of the other nations in the world, which were beginning to discover the power of the American system of political economy, whether it was France or Germany or Japan or China or Russia. Count Sergei Witte, the foreign minister I think the last foreign minister of Russia, was a passionate follower of Alexander Hamilton. In fact, there's actually works of his in the Library of Congress, which you can only access through the Rare Books Reading Room, which is his discussions of the importance of Alexander Hamilton and the American system. So, and you look at the history of British machinations in the decades leading up to World War I, it's to take all of the nations that were beginning to discover and act on this question of economic sovereignty. How do you become a sovereign, productive, and thereby usually peaceful nation? How do you pit them all against each other? Russia against Japan, China against Japan, and Germany against Russia. All, again, British geopolitics. If you don't know that history, then looking at Donald Trump, for some of our friends here in the United States who happily don't like wars, and they've played a certain valuable role, especially during the Biden administration, attacking the war hawk policies. But now they're completely confused by Donald Trump, because what they're missing is this deeper historical understanding. And they're just taking everything that is thrown at them at face value. The battle in the world, and Trump said it, is I want a world of sovereign nations, not not a globalist financier class. That's one of my favorite phrases from him, and he said it here in Michigan. He actually came out here during the UAW strike in 2023, and he said, "I'm calling on people to join me in the ultimate strike against the globalist financier class."
Oh, wow.
Yeah, that's my favorite quote.
That's symphony to my ears.
So he gets it. And he obviously has people in his administration at the top who get it. J.D. Vance gets it clearly. I was just thinking of, we're very close to the anniversary, not only of the assassination attempt against Trump, but 2 days later, he was at the Republican National Convention in Milwaukee. I was privileged to be there as a delegate from Michigan. And I'll never, and the Michigan delegation was fortunate to be seated right below the VIP balcony, which is where Trump was. The candidate doesn't go on stage until the last day. So the very first night he came in, which was the first time that we had seen him since the assassination attempt, and you could see on his face, that he knew the magnitude of what had just happened. But I have to say that when we heard on the floor of the convention, and we heard later than most people were getting the news alerts on their phones, that he had appointed J.D. Vance as his vice president, I practically cried, because that was my prayer and my hope, because this guy gets it in terms of the American system and in terms of a American peaceful foreign policy, keeping us out of perpetual wars. So he has people around him. Hegseth gets it. Tulsi gets it on the foreign policy front. On the economic front, I keep saying how amusing I find it to just be in love with a U.S. Treasury Secretary. Did I ever think that would be the case? Treasury secretaries are the worst creatures from Wall Street that you can imagine. And of course, Bessent himself was a hedge fund manager and worked for George Soros. We all know. But no, he is a Trumper in terms of economic policy. So Trump has at the top people who are committed to this change in the system. Now, he doesn't have a whole lot of bench underneath that. And, one of our jobs at Promethean Action, and is to educate Trump's base so that they will actually back him up and not get buffeted back and forth by Steve Bannon having a hysterical fit this morning, about how Trump is sold out to the neocons and so on. No, calm down. Doesn't mean everything he's going to do is going to be right. I seriously doubt that. But just calm down, because there is clearly a commitment. And the J.D. Vance appointment, to me, that was the point at which I said, okay, that's it. He gets it.
For those who don't know, I know a little bit about his, he served in the military. He's anti-war. Why is J.D. Vance's appointment? He's articulate as well, and, a really good speaker and smart and successful. Why is his appointment so critical, as you say?
Two reasons. The one, which is perhaps more obvious to a larger audience, is his very passionate anti-war position. But I think and there's a lot of people who have that kind of orientation. But what's really profound about him is he understands the American system of political economy. He actually understands that you have to invest in your workforce, you have to lift up the productivity of your workforce, that wealth actually comes from physical production and man's mind intervening into making your physical production better. He lives and breathes and embodies this question of the American system. He gave a beautiful speech maybe a month and a half ago to steel workers at a steel plant in South Carolina. I think it's called Nucor. And he talked about the pride that his grandfather, who was a steel worker, had in this kind of work. You know, he said we'd be driving around and he'd point to a product that his steel was in and, you know, this product and that product. Well, I had the same experience. My dad was a production manager at Ford and he did bumpers, coil springs, and torsion bars. And we'd be walking through a parking lot and all of a sudden he'd disappear. Where'd Dad go? Well, he was down on his knees checking the bumpers on the Ford cars to make sure that the product was actually holding up. You lived it. You literally lived it. This productive identity is what I think is really fundamental to restoring in the United States, and I think we have it better than anybody in the world. You know, here in Michigan, it's still very much alive. We were the arsenal of democracy. You know, we built the armaments that defeated Hitler and so on, and we were able to do it because of the American system. And JD lives this, he breathes this. And this is foundational as far as I'm concerned, because you can be for peace as much as you want, but if you don't know how to create nations which are economically stable, strong, and prosperous, and are not going to be undermined by the British central banking system and then used as pawns, you can be for peace all you want. You're never going to get it.
Well, exactly. American people, with perhaps the second term of George W. Bush, after 9/11, understandably, American people have always voted for anti-war candidates consistently, yet they always got more wars.
Yeah, because we really haven't had the American system since McKinley. And that's where this century and a half wars have come from. You know, it was the threat of the spread of a system of economics which serves the nation and serves the people, not the central bankers. You know, the central banking system proliferated on the model of the Bank of England. Of course, the Bank of England was modeled on the Dutch, and the Dutch were modeled on the Venetians. But in the modern period, basically, the Bank of England is the model for the imposition of central banking. We didn't have central banking in the United States until 1913 with the Federal Reserve. And, you know, so it's the same. Look at this pivotal period of time. McKinley revived the American system with tariffs, with investment in industry. McKinley was a passionate defender of labor and lifting up the living standard, a Republican, right? And he believed in ensuring that your labor force was paid so they could be productive, so that they could be happy, prosperous citizens, and so on. He was working with other countries, spreading these ideas to other countries. This would have been the death knell of the British imperial system if these policies had spread. So what happened? McKinley is assassinated in 1901. The British are already in the process of starting all these lovely little wars, which culminate in World War I. And right smack, we get a card-carrying British agent as President of the United States, Woodrow Wilson. Well, Teddy Roosevelt was at least half card-carrying British agent. He's been whitewashed a little bit more. But Woodrow Wilson just wanted to impose the British system on the United States. And then under Wilson, we join World War I. We get the Federal Reserve. We get the income tax. So for the last 125 years or so, you haven't seen a functioning American system. You haven't seen the United States function unfettered. Roosevelt probably came as close as any, Franklin Roosevelt probably came as close as any president to restoring it. And I also noted in my update this very interesting thing that Trump did at the end of his cabinet meeting, because they're in the cabinet room, and he decides to explain to everybody all the new portraits that he's pulled out of the White House archives to decorate the cabinet room. And it's not surprising that he's got Washington and Lincoln and McKinley. I was a little bit surprised about Polk, but he said he was a real estate magnate, so maybe that's why he put him up. I don't know. Polk's not one of my favorite presidents. But then he goes into a fairly long dissertation about Franklin Roosevelt, that he was a great president, a four-term president. The portrait we had looked like it was drawn by a kid. It looked like a cartoon. I went and found a much more beautiful portrait of Roosevelt and made sure it had a good frame. How many people picked up on that? And Roosevelt is one of the presidents who got the question of the British Empire.
I don't think many people would have picked up on it because we're not taught this. We have to, you know, everything that everybody, including myself, right, learns about Trump is mediated through a largely hostile media that parrots the message that the globalist financialist cartel want to put out. That's what I'm getting. I like that phrase that he said that. So then what
Well,
is,
I just wanted to add this. It's not just the media, is the whole education system. And I've noticed that when the British go into other countries, they always like to dig their claws into the country's education system, as they're doing in Syria now, in spite of the fact the Syrian people are some of the most educated people in the world. And I think that the effect of that is what I wrote in a Substack article a few days ago, is that the American people celebrate Independence Day, but if you ask them independence from what, from who, they don't know anymore, and that can't be random. This is like the most significant event in their country's history. How can they not know? It can't be. It can only be by design. So somebody made sure that those lessons of history are purged out of the popular culture, as is the alliance between Russia and the United States that lasted practically throughout the whole of the 19th century. People have no idea.
Right.
Alex, that's
And
good.
it's not just who we won independence from, because if you're out there in the MAGA movement, they know. I mean, they're passionate patriots. They know their history. But they think it's independence from paying taxes, or it's independence from big government, or something like that. Part of the really evil side of ideological penetration is when people don't know the actual principles. It boils down to a thing. So we threw boxes of tea in Boston Harbor because we didn't want to pay taxes. Really, that is not what it was about. It was the fact that our founding fathers had a completely different conception of the image of man, that all men are created equal and endowed by their creator with certain inalienable rights. That there's no such thing as a subject versus a citizen. The people are sovereign, not some monarch. It's a fundamentally different conception, that each human being brings the potential for something precious to society, because each human being is born with a creative potential which can contribute to society, and it doesn't have anything to do with money. Which is why the whole question of balancing the budget and taxes and all the rest of this kind of stuff, it just muddies it. So I know, because I'm out there. I mean, I'm an official in the Michigan Republican Party, so I'm out there all the time, talking to the MAGA base, and they are patriots, and they are passionate patriots, but even many of them actually don't understand the fundamental principles, which is why they can then get whipped back and forth on certain things. And my biggest job is that kind of education. You love this country. You love the Constitution. You love the Declaration of Independence. You love Donald Trump. Do you actually understand them? I mean, thank God you love them. That's a good start. That's better than a crazy Kamala Harris supporter, right? But you have to know more than that. I was at a meeting last night, and somebody afterwards stood up and spoke and said, let's not forget what Benjamin Franklin said. I've given you a republic if you can keep it. It means the citizens have to do some work. You can't just wave a flag. It's better than burning a flag, but you actually have to know what that flag stands for.
Right.
As they say, the price of freedom is eternal vigilance.
Yes.
And I think that the mainstream media, which as I gather, is very much controlled by the British, they have made sure that people are kind of hypnotized and not vigilant. Susan, I just wanted to add, this whole thing about fiscal conservatism and paying down the debts and reducing the deficits and small government, it is mathematically impossible given the monetary system that we have in place today. So anybody who's promising small government, I think that many conservatives are very sincere about this, but it's impossible. And all that it can achieve is to push the ultimate collapse farther into the future at a cost of a deep recession now. It cannot prevent the system's collapse. It practically took me a lifetime to work that out. But this is something that people need to understand, that what is needed is not cutting spending, paying down debts, reducing deficits and so forth. What is needed is an overhaul of the monetary system. And so I think that once people understand this, then I think they will be much more receptive to what Trump is doing with his big, beautiful bill, because I think that his ultimate objective is to reindustrialize, to probably diversify the banking system, to create a level playing field for local and regional banks that can then fund the development of small and medium-sized businesses, which always and everywhere in every economy are the main drivers of growth, of innovation, of prosperity, and of job creation. The money cannot be saved anyhow.
That's right. It's funny. Last night, after I spoke on that fact that Trump had that perspective, and people should just calm down about the raising the debt ceiling and for the time being and so on, one lady raised her hand. She said, "Yeah, I just want to tell people nobody ever saved themselves into getting rich. They went out and they invented something, they produced something, they created something." And no, you've hit the nail right on the head, because this whole question of a balanced budget, there's a very dangerous thing floating around here in the United States called Convention of States, which has been cooked up by the elites, claiming that we can use Article 5 of the Constitution, and since we can't get Congress to balance the budget, and since these congressmen are so terrible, we need term limits, and we can't get Congress to do this, then we need to hold a constitutional convention to do this. And of course, if we ever had a constitutional convention, it would be used to wreck the republic. But, the elephant in the room, which just shows what a fraud this is our Constitution works just fine. But we have unconstitutional institutions like the Federal Reserve, which is precisely the point that you're making. As long as you're in a central banking run system, it's not going to work. If you cut the budget today to balance it, you'd be killing half of the American population. Now, as we've all said, there's a lot of crap that can be cut in the budget. Fine, cut it. But you're not going to get a balanced budget that way in 2025, 2026, 2027. You got to grow your way out. I was actually shocked because I saw Newt Gingrich the other day speaking, and he used to be the contract on America, and it was the ultimate budget cutting, budget balancing. But Donald Trump is recruiting a lot of people to think the way he is, and he was I was quite shocked. He was very explicit, that Trump has. He said you can't balance the budget by cutting it. Newt Gingrich. He said Trump has got a 3, 4, 5-year plan between tariffs, tax cuts, investment, and so on to build our way out of this deficit. Now, as he and his whole team is picking a fight right now with the Fed, because what Jerome Powell is doing is hamstringing it by keeping the interest rates up artificially. That, of course, leads to increases in the cost of government borrowing, as well as throttling economic development to a certain extent. So, I think what Trump is doing, and, he's had his team out there in full. Scott Bessent, Peter Navarro, they're all out there taking on the Fed, attacking Jerome Powell, beating up on Jerome Powell. Larry Kudlow was talking about the Fed being the equivalent of an economic deep state. We need perestroika at the Fed. Well, frankly, we need to get rid of it. So, but I think what Trump is doing is preliminarily kind of educating people to the nature of the problem. Now, getting rid of the Fed is not an easy lift. And do I think that Donald Trump is going to be able to do it in this term? I'd be thrilled, but I'd also be surprised. But I think what he's looking at is maybe, in the immediate term, first of all, educating the American people to the problem that you have this independent entity over there, and all he can do is yell at it. But then he gets to choose a new Fed chair next year. And he's going to pick somebody who's got a different kind of outlook. Now, go back to Roosevelt. It was the same thing with Roosevelt. His Fed chair, I don't know how many he had, but one of them was Mariner Eccles. Believe it or not, a Mormon from Utah. But Eccles worked in sync with Roosevelt to use the discount window of the Fed as a way of actually channeling credit into the productive activity. So that during Roosevelt's time, the Fed was not only, this conveyor belt for Wall Street, because it still was that. Again, that's the nature of the beast. But they were able to do a kind of end run And the Fed worked with other institutions like the Reconstruction Finance Corporation and others to figure out how to actually get credit out into the productive economy, which was one of the critical things in terms of the war mobilization, which started in 1940. So I have a feeling that that's how Trump is thinking, that, use this period now to educate people that the problem is not over here, it's over here. It's the Federal Reserve, it's central banking. Put in a chairman next year who will be able to, begin to move. At least the Fed will no longer be an impediment to Trump's policies and use whatever capabilities that may exist, to ameliorate it, and then we have to continue the Trump revolution after 2028. And just, from my seat of the pants, we get through this 4 years successfully, then maybe you're going to lay the basis for discussing how do you actually get rid of this institution and go back to national banking. You have a lot of people in the MAGA movement who want to snap their fingers and say, end the Fed tomorrow. That's not going to happen. I don't even think it could happen under the current circumstances, because you actually also have to have something in its place. What form will national banking take in the 21st century? I don't know. Well, when Lincoln revived the question of national banking, he didn't create a national bank. Hamilton had a national bank. Lincoln didn't have a national bank. He had a national banking system. So it was different, but it was the same principle, which is the purpose of banking is to get credit out to the productive sector, not to be a parasite sucking wealth out of the population and feeding it to central bankers and global financiers. So I don't know what a 21st century form of national banking will look like. I know the principles.
I wonder, Susan. So could this be leading to an explanation of Trump's approach regarding Bitcoin and Ripple and cryptocurrencies in general? Because the other day he relaxed a whole load of rules. And
I would be punching way above my weight class to say too much about that. You guys
ride the blockchain?
Probably are probably, in the ring on that one. But just from the standpoint of a general principle, to me, it always has to come back to sovereign control over your currency. Now, what they feed off of is people despair over the fact that we don't. I mean, we had the Federal Reserve, then the Bretton Woods system was ended in 1971, and the dollar was taken off the gold reserve standard. Now we're in a world of floating currencies where the currencies are just commodities and playthings of the global financier elite. So is there some safe place I can put my money? I see where the impulse comes from, but I think it's a certain surrender, to the despair that you will never have a sovereign economic system again. I think we have to have sovereign economic systems with sovereign currencies. And that's a heavy lift. That's not going to happen in 2025 or 6 or probably 7 or 8. But that's what has to be in your mind. And are there interim steps? Look, Trump has also called for his cabinet to look at the creation of a sovereign wealth fund, which we don't have and other countries have.
Yep.
Where you get big private investments into a sovereign fund, which then can be used to finance infrastructure projects. Okay. That's not the same thing as a national bank, but it's like a mini national bank. So he's obviously got these ideas.
Yeah. Alex, you want to come in?
Oh, no, that's okay. I was just listening. Well, the question about the next monetary system is going to have to be thought through very thoroughly. I think maybe the only people who are actually doing it today, probably not the only ones, but the only ones who have taken it very far and who are deliberately focused on that problem matter are the Russians. And I think they're even ahead of the Chinese in that respect. And I think that, given the knowledge we have today, given the information exchange capabilities, given the computing horsepower and software engineering horsepower that we have to run simulations about what the effect of this or that policy provision or feature of the system could be, there's no reason why we couldn't come up with the best possible solution that can be designed. and then, refine it over the years. So I believe that will be done. I think that the renewed alliance between, or, doesn't have to be military alliance, but more like a, comprehensive partnership between the United States and Russia will be very, very important in this respect. There's going to be
Yeah.
something. Yeah, please go ahead.
As you probably know, one of the last major initiatives Lyndon LaRouche made before he passed was this idea of a four-power alliance. That if you're going to create a new global financial system, you have to have the major four powers. It has to include the United States, which is the flaw of the BRICS. And I think we can sort of see how that's playing out because China and Russia didn't show up for the most recent meeting. But the United States, Russia, China, India. Those are the four major superpowers in the world that you have to bring together if you are going to create a new monetary system, a new financial architecture. And as you said, Alex, the fact that Trump talks to Putin, that he talks to Xi, this has got to have the empire faction completely freaked out, and they are willing to gamble with World War III to stop that. Yep. Because it's game over. If you have these four major countries, and when you look at the complement in terms of their economies or the skill sets they bring to the world economy, or their size of their populations. Russia doesn't have a big population, but of course it's got huge natural resources. It's obviously got an extraordinary scientific tradition. Each country brings something very, very important and very unique into that. But those are the four pillars for a new monetary system in the world. And what's been missing out of the potential for that has been the United States. And with Trump, it's there, which is why it is such a threat and why I think they are willing to play with nuclear matches if they have to try and stop. So far, he's outflanked him. So far, he hasn't fallen for anything.
I think it's a little bit worse than that. According to the information that I have from military circles, and I'm not talking about Pentagon military circles or NATO, but let's say people who are close to these military circles and talk to them, it seems that they're actually doing their utmost to trigger a military conflict somewhere, except they cannot be seen as the instigators of a first strike nuclear attack somewhere. So what they're trying to do, what they have been trying to do for a few years now, is they've been trying to provoke either Russia or Iran or Pakistan to launch a nuclear strike somewhere, to cause absolute chaos and mayhem, because they think that this is the only way that they could save themselves and their system. And it seems to me that if all else fails, because the Russians see their game, I think that Pakistanis see their game by now. That the Iranians definitely see their game. I think if all else fails, they will sacrifice Israel and they'll have Netanyahu launch a nuclear attack.
Oh, God. I mean, I think, that's certainly a possibility. Something we've always talked about is the danger of a breakaway ally, which Netanyahu certainly fills the bill. But I think, look at what Trump is doing in some of these things that, set the hair on fire of his base, saying drop the trial against Netanyahu. He's got important work to do. He is playing 5D chess, in terms of recognizing, it's been speculated and it certainly makes sense. He launched the strike on Iran so that Israel wouldn't launch a nuclear attack on Iran, to essentially try and take that off the table. And I think that is how he thinks. So, these guys are evil. They will gamble with blowing up the world, but I think it's possible they've actually met their match.
God, I hope so. There've been so many. There've been so many that they've killed off: JFK, McKinley, Lincoln. Now, I want to take it back to something about schooling, because I'm curious to know, Alex, what is it? I didn't know what are the British doing with the schools in Syria? And then there's something I'd like to add to this conversation.
Oh yes, so we know a lot about this because there are these organizations in the world that I didn't know they existed, but I can't rattle off the exact name of the organization, but it's something to the effect exactly of inspecting the content of curriculum of an education system, something like that. They went to Gaza, for example. No, not to Gaza, to West Bank, I think. And what they do is they take the school curriculum, they take the textbooks, and they read them, and they see what's in the textbooks. And they found out, so the British have been very deeply involved in the Palestinian education system. And I think that to this day, the British have about 30,000 Palestinian teachers on their payroll in, some way or another. And they found that the curriculum is very much geared towards radicalizing the Muslim youth. So they glorify martyrdom, they glorify rebellion, they glorify violence, and they kind of do this in strange ways. But like they will put question in the text: isn't drinking a cup of bitterness now better than a lifetime of humiliation and subjugation? Things like that, And then they'll have mathematical problems, even like if Yusuf launched 5 rocks at the Israelis and he has 10 rocks in his bag, how many? These kinds of things. I'm not the report that this organization that I can't name right now actually took out a lot of these examples, and they're similar to what I'm saying. I just can't give you the literal exact examples. And then, it's not just the Palestine. They've also been very involved in education in Syria. They've been very involved in the education in Bosnia and Herzegovina and many other places. And they've also been very involved in the education, particularly of Muslim youth in France and in Britain. And there also there have been investigations that have shown that they are absolutely driven and aimed at radicalizing Muslim youth in places like Birmingham, for example. And so there are testimonials about this, and there are extensive reports about this. How this happens, I don't know exactly, but we're not meant to know. This all goes through, NGOs or Quangos, the quasi non-government organizations. The money usually comes from MI6 and the Foreign Office, for example, or the Home Office, and then it gets channeled through NGOs and then through private contractors that then are charged with writing the textbooks and publishing them and distributing them to these Muslim schools in England, in France, I think in Belgium as well, places like Molenbeek. And the effect is radicalizing the Muslim youth, kind of creating an incubator for future radicals, extremists, terrorists, jihadis that might commit terror acts at home or be sent to places like Syria, like Yemen, like Chechnya, Dagestan, wherever they need to stir the pot for their foreign policy objectives.
It's the master blaster. But instead of having a dwarf with one giant thug called the United States, right? They have this army of ants.
Yes.
These angry so-called Muslims that have been radicalized and think that violence is an answer, is a solution to the problems.
Yes. And if you take time to actually study Islam, what it is, what it's supposed to be, you realize that they are lying to them and they're misleading them in the most devious and most sinister way. To give you a concrete example, a lot of people in the West think that if a Muslim sacrifices himself in a jihad without ever bothering to define what even jihad is, that they will go to heaven and get 72 virgins. It's nowhere in Muslim scriptures. They completely invented this out of whole cloth. And then, they field these jihadis who, pray for a photo op, but they don't face the Mecca. They kind of face in a square. They face one another. It's beyond ridiculous, but it doesn't have to be well orchestrated. It doesn't have to be a Hollywood production. It's enough to go into the Western mainstream media, make an impression on the critical mass of the average consumer of the mainstream narrative, and that's the job done.
Yeah.
So
like the beheadings by ISIS.
Like the beheadings. Why does Iran have a fatwa against a nuclear weapon? Nobody questions this. It's exactly because in Islam it is proscribed to kill a non-combatant. And with a nuclear weapon, you cannot avoid killing innocent civilians. So that is why Iran, which has preserved Islam more or less in a pure form, has a fatwa against nuclear weapons. But in the West, nobody questions this, and they also don't question how come for the last more than 2,000 years there has been a very large community of Jews who live in Iran unmolested, and they're the second largest Jewish community in the whole of Middle East, after Israel. And if the Iranians are these genocidal anti-Semites who want to kill all the Jews, well, what's kept them from killing them in Iran? Right? They've had more than 2,000 years to do it. Obviously, they're lying to us. But I think it's so important to learn all these things, to understand them, and to try to communicate them so that we're not as easily misled as we might have been, before the internet, before the social media, before the podcasts, and all of these things.
Okay. Well, I don't know if I mentioned this to you, Susan, when we recorded our interview. My son's going to be 21 end of August, and my daughter will be 18. They never went to school. They were home educated, and in particular, unschooled, which meant they just played and played and played. And one of the many reasons for that was because I got to learn how schooling, because I always wondered, why did my cousins in Pakistan start school at 5? Makes no sense. 5. 7 makes sense, because there's all sorts of developmental changes. The Jesuits say, give us a boy till the age of 7, then we'll give you the man. In the Quran and Steiner school, no academic education before the age of 7. There's all sorts of changes that happen around the age of 7. Why? Well, the 1870 Education Act in England said that children could go to school at 5, finish at 10, because then they'd have 5 years schooling, which was enough for them to know what they needed to know before they went down the mines. So my cousins go to school in Pakistan because of the needs of the English mining industry and the Welsh mining industry. And then, how schools have been used to grab Aboriginal children, separate them from their families, inculcate them with Christianity, to destroy their heritage and their language, and co-opt them. And I think it was Woodrow Wilson. He said, what we want is we want a separate system of school. I'm paraphrasing here. A separate system of schooling for the elites, for the leaders, and then regular schools for the followers, for everybody else. And I think in the United States, this is from research I did a few years ago, it's illegal or unpermissible to teach dialectic inquiry in government schools, in state schools. So the top private schools get it. They get dialectic inquiry, how to look at an argument from all sorts of different angles, but not for the plebs who send their kids to school. And then the absurdity. I didn't know what was going on in terms of how schools are being used to radicalize and corrupt Islam and bring about, these thugs, these angry ants. That's what they are, right? That the British can then use to stir dissent wherever needed. But I knew MI6 were behind ISIS and Al Qaeda and what they're doing, because ISIS never attack or condemn Israel, right? All right, no hint there, right? And I have done videos where I've looked at the sexualization agenda being rolled out by the World Health Organization and the United Nations, which is in place in Britain and in Ireland, where 12-year-old girls are, and boys, are books being made available to them in public libraries talking about fisting. What does a 12-year-old need to know about fisting? That whole trans agenda. But here's how absurd it is, and then we can move on. Some schools in Britain are stopping children from going out in the playgrounds to play because it's too hot. So the last few days, we got 25 to 30 degrees, which is 70 to 80 degrees Fahrenheit. It's too hot to play outside because climate change. I mean, are you kidding? What do they do in Africa? What do they do in the Middle East? Everybody there is dead because of the sun. There are no white South Africans because they all died because of the sun. Sorry.
Well, there's another angle to that, Rich, that I wanted to mention. When you look at Great Britain, and you see a lot of these people who come into power, like Boris Johnson and George Osborne and Rishi Sunak and Keir Starmer and people like Lord Mountbatten and I could go on and on and on and on with the list. They're all kind of devious degenerates, and so you ask yourself, like, where do they find them? And it turns out that they actually form them, that they have this whole boarding school industry where people send their children and pay for the privilege of having them emotionally, psychologically, and sexually abused. And then they turn out these depraved monsters. Of course, not all of them, but then they basically create like a recruitment system, and you have a system where smaller boarding schools actually choose and feed candidates for these elite schools like Eton. I don't know how you pronounce that thing.
Eton, yeah.
And there's been a lot of reports and investigations and court cases about this. And when you read into it a little bit, it's really truly monstrous what they do. But a lot of these people, like Boris Johnson and the likes, are actually products of these boarding schools.
Yeah, and then
I mean, if you really want to look at sort of one of the fathers of this, I don't have the quote at my fingertips, and I think it's from the book called The Impact of Science on Society, Bertrand Russell.
Bertrand Russell, yeah.
Is explicit about this, that there are two kinds of education. There's one education for the elites, and there's another education for the lower classes. And in one really chilling passage, he says, but you have to keep your eye out on these lower classes, because sometimes you'll find somebody with special intellect, and you can't. What you have to do is you have to bring them into the elites and basically see if they're ready to be trained and be part of the elites. If they're not, he uses the term unruly intellect. You cannot allow somebody with unruly intellect among the lower classes. And he literally uses the word, you may have to send them to the lethal chamber. He writes that. Because, and in a sense, that's what a Donald Trump is, right? He's an unruly intellect who they can't control, who's inspiring people who thought they had no power. And they tried to send him to the lethal chamber, in a number of different ways. But they're very, very conscious of that. And I don't remember which of the books, but there's a couple of different things that Russell wrote. But there's another one in which he talks about how you have to take children away from the family. You have to break the bonds of the family. You have to take them away from the family very early. And you're going to learn how to use repetitive music and drugs to basically shape them and control them. So, welcome to the 21st century with legal marijuana and, rap music. I mean, it's just right out of the British playbook.
Wow. Okay. Even rap music. Oh my God, the British are everywhere. Okay, let's go to Ukraine, Russia. So what's the thinking behind Trump here giving armaments to Ukraine? Why doesn't he just walk away?
Go ahead, Alex.
Yes, thank you. If I may, I wouldn't spend too much worrying on this one, because I think it's just rhetoric. It amounts to nothing. I think that they were talking about scraping 10 Patriot interceptors from the bottom of a barrel somewhere, which is pretty much nothing. I think it's, again, posturing for domestic audiences. And
the domestic audience doesn't want war in Ukraine.
No, I don't mean domestic audience as in of ordinary voters. I mean the political audience. People exerting influence in the halls of power, and there's still a lot of people who are loyal to the globalist empire, who want to see the United States rejoin the European alliance and provide security guarantees to Ukraine and go to war against Russia and blow up Iran and so forth. And so I think that these statements, these public relations stunts are to kind of blunt their edge and to release the pressure a little bit. I don't give a lot of importance to it. It is very obvious to everybody that whatever they provide to the Ukrainians isn't going to change the course of the war. Nothing short of going nuclear and providing an ironclad security guarantee will change anything. And providing an ironclad security guarantee would only mean that then the French and the British would toss in their, troops, what they call the reassurance troops, I think, reassurance forces, because the tripwire forces was a bit too obvious. And then, kind of trapping Trump and the United States back into that war. So, some token cartridges and 10 Patriot interceptors do absolutely nothing at all. It's meaningless.
Yeah, I agree with Alex. And when you're talking about the domestic audience, I mean, for the Trump revolution to be durable, we got to get through the midterms. He's got to keep the House. He's got to keep the Senate. He's got to be able to demonstrate substantial economic progress, because that's what's going to do it. Which means he had to get the one big beautiful bill through, which has got some very transformative stuff in it, extremely transformative. One of my favorite provisions in that bill is what's called 100% full expensing for new factories. If you're going to build a new factory in the United States and you start it between now and 2028, you get 100% of the cost of that taken off your taxes in year one. You don't amortize it over 30 years. Trump wants build. He wants people to get, shovels in the ground, start building things, ramp up the jobs, deliver real, tangible economic benefits to the American people. That's what he's got to do to win in 2026. And he needed Lindsey Graham's vote to do that. He needed the votes of people, who are horrible. And, hopefully we'll get primaried. Now, Trump is, he's going to have to play his cards in terms of whether he's going to endorse, whether he's not going to endorse. I mean, again, some of this is kind of up to his base. When we go out and organize in the streets, we always set up tables with big provocative signs and so on. And one of them is, Donald can't do it alone. There's just too much of that. Well, he's president, so he can do everything. No, he's got to deal with the Congress. He's got to deal with the Senate. He's got to deal with Bibi Netanyahu. He's got to deal with this. He's got to deal with that. So, he's dealing with a lot of moving parts. But what is fundamental in terms of him, in terms of 2026, and it's tough. I'm in probably the most important state. Michigan is one of the key swing states. We've got a governor's race. We've got an open Senate race. We have 4 congressional seats in play out of 20 that are really in play in 2026. Right here in Michigan could determine whether or not Trump keeps his majority in the House and the Senate. And there's only one way it's going to happen. And that is if he delivers tangible economic benefits to this base. He's not going to get, unless we get a full-blown Abraham Accord and end all of the killing in the Mideast. And I'm not ruling that out, but unless we get that, he is not going to get the same portion of the vote from the Mideastern community, from Dearborn, Hamtramck, which was really critical to putting him over the top in Michigan. I was recently at a meeting with other party leaders here with people in the Mideastern community. It happened to be 2 days before. It was after Israel started bombing Iran, but before Operation Midnight Hammer. And that was a tense meeting with people in this community. And, people who had prominently supported him in the business community were basically saying, I've changed my mind. I made a mistake. It was going to be hard. Now, not everybody. We have the very courageous mayor of Hamtramck, who was the first person to endorse Trump. He's been appointed as an ambassador. One of the other mayors has been appointed as an ambassador. They're solid. Their communities are solid. The Hamtramck mayor is Yemeni. That community is less everybody's agonized over Gaza, but it's less than some of the other communities in Dearborn. We've got a big job here in Michigan. I know how big it is, because we're not going to have, I don't think, that same level of support from that community. And that was critical in terms of delivering Michigan, which means we're going to have to build in other areas. And that is the blue collar vote, the urban minority vote, and so on. And that just keeps coming back to economics. He's got to be able to deliver, which means he's got to compromise. This is what Alex is talking about. certainly on the domestic side, he's got to get this stuff through the Congress, so that he can deliver, so we can make this permanent. We want to make this permanent.
Yeah, he's got to compromise, make deals. And what you're saying about what's happening in Michigan and what you've got to cause is a really, really good reason why people should subscribe and become members of Promethean Action. Another link in the description below to support the work that you're doing in educating people. Okay, now what about the UK and Europe? How is Trump playing them?
Well, I think I mentioned this the last time we spoke. What struck me is when he went to NATO, he kept talking about how much patriotic passion he saw in the leaders around the room. Now, I don't know if that was true, and I don't know if he even believes that, right? But he was making a point, which is Trump wants to deal with nations as nations, not as appendages of a European Union or of some other kind of supranational entity. And how that is then going to play out, because that's how he's not really dealing with the European Union as in any way, shape, or form. And of course, remember when he went to the G7 in Alberta, one of the things he threw out in the press conference is what a mistake it had been to throw Russia out, right? And basically saying you guys are meaningless because you threw Russia out. He doesn't have any use for these supranational institutions. I mean, he'll use it as a stage, I think, as appropriate. So, I think he wants to deal nation to nation. And the question of the UK, I'm not going to try and get into Trump's brain in terms of how he's playing this one.
Susan,
I'm happy to hear your opinion, but I'm not going to try and get in there.
It's so awful here and getting more and more so. Oh my God, it's horrific. Alex.
Well, I think that we saw how he was dealing with Great Britain when Keir Starmer was visiting. It wasn't particularly friendly. I was stunned when a journalist during their press conference, when the journalist asked about Canada, and Keir Starmer started rambling about, oh no, this is meaningless. This is an artificial division. You're raising a point that is not even any kind of a contention. And Trump says, like, that's enough. Next question. I've never seen a statesman interrupt his host, his guest, with "that's enough." and then Keir Starmer theatrically brought an envelope with King Charles's invitation for the unprecedented second state visit to Britain. And has Trump gone?
I think it's coming in September.
Sorry?
I think it's coming in September.
For a state visit?
I think so.
Okay. Well, we'll see how that goes.
It'll be entertaining.
But
sure.
But then you look at the relations with Canada, which is still on the agenda and will remain on the agenda. And there's a gathering separatist movement in Alberta. And Premier Danielle Smith is touring Alberta as we speak to hear from her constituents, but she's also delivering them a message. And she posted a very, very strong message saying how much Alberta is paying into the federal budget, how much they're getting back, how the Ottawa government is frustrating Alberta's development and industrialization and the building of pipelines and infrastructure and on and on and on, like very, very serious, significant grievances. And something is going to blow up there. Something's going to blow up there. And it's not going to be to the pleasure of the British government or of King Charles. I think that Trump is dead serious about annexing Canada, or at least a major chunk of it, maybe except for Quebec. I don't know. But
well, Quebec isn't all that happy under a British monarch, so who knows?
Except for Ontario. Who wants Ontario?
Yes,
really.
exactly. I was thinking Ontario, and what else is there? That Prince what straight?
Prince Edward Island or something.
Prince Edward Island. Yeah, maybe he'll leave that to King Charles.
Yeah, right.
Susan, any comment about U.S.-Canadian relations? What Trump's
Well,
going to do?
I agree with Alex. I think Trump is very, very serious. And if I remember the headlines, he's, slapping another round of tariffs on them. And, Canada is the classic, imperial colony. They can't stand on their own 2 feet economically. So I think we've got the cards as far as that goes. Now, clearly, putting the central banker of all central bankers, Mark Carney, in as prime minister. I mean, the only person who's ever been the head of the Bank of Canada and the head of the Bank of England is pretty much a statement of how important they want to try and navigate this situation with Trump. And obviously Justin Trudeau was not up to the task. But no, I think Trump is serious. He's not going to take any crap from Canada.
Yeah, and then I think it's important also because they built up Mark Carney into this giant of intellect, very capable banker, blah blah blah. But he's been in charge of the Bank of England as the British economy was disintegrating. He's been the head economic advisors to Justin Trudeau as Canada's economy disintegrated. So I think it's excellent that they put him in charge there because his track record is very encouraging, and I think that maybe within Trump's term, Canada really is going to become part of the United States.
Well done, Mr. Carney. Well done. Okay.
Or as they say in Alberta, Mr. Carnage.
Mr. Carnage.
Carnage. Very good. Very good. Okay. Alex, Susan, any last words, anything you want to say before we finish up? Anything we haven't covered?
Well, I think, what we didn't discuss, and I'm very happy we didn't discuss, which is the Epstein case. But I bring it up only from the standpoint that I think that there's a real massive psychological warfare operation being waged against Trump's base itself, to demoralize them, to try and convince them that he's sold out. I guess Steve Bannon and Charlie Kirk today were off to the races in terms of that kind of stuff. It kind of reminds me of kindergartners. I mean, your attention span really needs to grow a little bit. But it also gets back to this fundamental question is, if you're dealing with a unique historical individual, which we are with Donald Trump, as we were with Abraham Lincoln, George Washington, as examples, who are clear in their principles. That's what's so important. We have not had that many presidents in the United States, and probably fewer leaders around the world, who are actually clear in terms of their principles. And then they operate from that standpoint, rather than just the pragmatic, political, I'm living within a world defined by somebody else's rules, and for the past 120, 130 years, really since, in a certain sense, we lost the United States with Woodrow Wilson. We've had some fight back with a few presidents, but, people have sort of accommodated to living in this world run by a global financier elite, the modern day British Empire. And so you just make your decisions practically and pragmatically within that world. And then the talking heads and the commentators try and look at each individual decision and project what it means tomorrow and so on and so forth. People have just got to recognize you're living in a world you have never lived in before. You're living in a world where you have somebody who is operating from the standpoint of principle, who has managed to get back into the White House after everything they did in his first term, preventing a second immediate term, trying to kill him, lawfare. You have this guy back in there. He's only been in there for 5.5 months. Let's remember that. And as Marco Rubio went through, look at the things he's settled. Congo, Rwanda, India, Pakistan. We're not at war with Iran right now, and on and on and on. Because he's operating from the standpoint of a set of principles, which is that that nations must be allowed to function as sovereign entities, and that the purpose of their economic system is to uplift their population and expand their ability to grow and produce. That all of that falls under the category of the American system. People have not seen that in their lifetimes.
Yeah.
Now, I was fortunate for 5 decades to study the history of it, so I'm not unfamiliar with what Trump is doing because I know it historically. Now we're living through it, which is actually pretty heady. But if you don't know the history, you have trouble figuring out what he's doing. And I thank you for the shout out to Promethean Action. But if people want to learn the history, go to our website. You know, I'm often out talking to MAGA activists, and they're bouncing off walls because of this, that, or the other thing. And I get pretty blunt with some of them. If you don't understand the American hit system, if you haven't gone back and rediscovered this hidden history of the United States, then shut up. You know, you don't have a right to criticize Donald Trump. And you're not capable of representing him. You got to go out and do some work, because what he is doing is absolutely unique. Is it going to work? I don't know. Is he going to make mistakes along the way? I'm sure he is. He's not the second coming of Christ. He's a human being. He's fallible. But this is different, to actually have somebody operating from the standpoint of these principles. Roosevelt was frankly the last one. Kennedy, if he had lasted a little bit longer, might have ended up at that same level. But in our lifetimes, because probably most of us weren't around when Franklin Roosevelt was president, you have not seen this.
Thank you, Susan. Alex?
Well, I wholeheartedly agree with all that. And I would also like to say that for people who are in doubt, as many are, and sometimes I am too, about whether Trump is a sellout, whether it's all some kind of a big 5D deception that is being played, you have to consider that maybe he is for real. So you have to ask yourself, what if he is for real? And I think that the most tragic mistake would be to abandon the project, to abandon the revolution, just because of doubt. And as Susan mentioned, the poster that says Trump can do it alone. Exactly, this is the all hands on deck moment. So even if you harbor doubts, it's still an all hands on deck moment. You can think of this as a ship sailing through a storm. The odds of the ship sailing through the storm successfully is if we all hold our heads together, you know, as the British like to say, keep calm and carry on. If you all go crazy and start embracing defeatism because we feel like maybe we're being betrayed, well, maybe you're not being betrayed. Maybe you just don't understand everything that's going on, because none of us do. So just keep calm and carry on. And I think that this is perhaps the best chance we've had to change the course of history and to change the future of humanity, because the other side wants us as hackable animals. And if we lose the battle, if we cease manning our stations and let the ship sink, then our children will be hackable animals. So keep calm and carry on. And I think that we're in a better shape than we've ever been in the past.
Alex, thank you. And I would just extend that keep calm and carry on. Keep calm and carry on. Subscribe, comment, like, share this, and also follow Susan Kokinda and Promethean Action. Links in the description below. And same for Alex. Follow Alex on X and his Substack. Really, really appreciate both of you doing this. Thank you, thank you, thank you, thank you. All the best. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.